The night sky over Scotland was dark and still on November 12, 1944. Beneath it, 200 young men climbed into their Lancaster bombers, each aircraft heavy with fuel, explosives, and unspoken fear. Engines roared against the cold, trembling runways as one by one the bombers rose into the Arctic night. Their destination, the edge of the world. They were flying north, toward Norway, toward a fjord buried inside the Arctic Circle. Their mission was to destroy the most feared warship left in Hitler's navy, the Tirpitz. For years, the British had hunted this ship. It had survived midget submarines, dive bombers, torpedoes, and sabotage. 33 times the Allies had tried to sink it. 33 times it had survived. It became known as the unsinkable. To Hitler, Tirpitz was a symbol of German power and pride, the sister ship of the Bismarck, but stronger, faster, deadlier. To Churchill, it was something else entirely, a nightmare that haunted his war councils, a beast lurking in the frozen north, threatening to strike at any moment. He called it the Beast. And now the task of killing that beast had fallen to the men of 2 elite RAF units, 617 Squadron, known to history as the Dambusters, and 9 Squadron, one of the most decorated bomber groups in Britain. Their orders were simple on paper: destroy the Tirpitz. In reality, it was suicide. The battleship lay protected by mountains, mist, and radar. Its anti-aircraft batteries could fill the sky with steel. And just minutes away, the Luftwaffe's best fighter aces waited at their Arctic airfield, ready to intercept any Allied intruder. But none of that stopped them. They were young, confident, and, like so many of their generation, utterly fearless. One of the airmen later recalled, "It never occurred to us that we were in danger. The chap beside us might be, but we weren't." As their bombers climbed into the blackness, the sea below shimmered with moonlight. The world was asleep, unaware that history's final great battleship hunt had just begun. Ahead of them waited a journey across empty seas, over enemy territory, and through freezing winds that could kill a man in minutes if he fell from the sky. Each Lancaster carried one single weapon, a 12,000-pound tall-boy bomb, designed to pierce armor thicker than a battleship's hull. They called it Operation Catechism. It would be the RAF's last attempt to sink the unsinkable, and the final test of whether precision, courage, and sheer luck could finish what 2 years of failed raids could not. No one knew it then, but within hours the beast of the north would vanish beneath the icy waters of Tromsø fjord, and the men who destroyed it would return home unscathed against all odds. It was a mission that should have failed, but it didn't. Long before the raid of 1944, the name Tirpitz already carried a shadow. Launched in April 1939, she was the pride of Hitler's navy, the largest and most powerful battleship Europe had ever seen. Her launch was announced with triumph across Germany. But for the rest of the world, it was a warning. The ship stretched 823 feet from bow to stern, longer than 2 football fields. She weighed over 52,000 tons when fully loaded. Her 8 15-inch guns could fire shells heavier than a small car, 17 miles beyond the horizon, able to strike before the enemy even knew she was there. And unlike her sister ship, the Bismarck, which had been hunted and sunk in 1941, the Tirpitz was meant to be unsinkable. Her sides were clad in armor up to 13 inches thick, her compartments sealed and reinforced against torpedoes and aerial bombs. Every inch of her was engineered to survive. For the German High Command, she was not just a weapon. She was a statement. To Hitler, the Tirpitz represented the invincibility of the Third Reich at sea. To Churchill, she was a thorn lodged in the throat of the Allied war effort, an unpredictable menace haunting the northern waters. After the fall of Norway in 1940, Hitler ordered Tirpitz north into the fjords, deep, narrow inlets carved by ice and shadow, where cliffs rose higher than any plane could easily descend. Hidden beneath camouflage nets and fog, she was safe from direct attack. There, in the Arctic, she waited, patient, unseen. It was not her guns that made her dangerous, but her presence. Convoys of merchant ships carried fuel, food, and weapons from Britain to the Soviet Union, a lifeline that kept the Eastern Front alive. Every time word spread that the Tirpitz might be moving, Allied admirals panicked. Convoys scattered. Escorts were pulled away. The mere rumor of her movement was enough to paralyze the Arctic sea lanes. She was called the Phantom of the North. The Royal Navy called her the Lonely Queen of the North. To Churchill, she was still the Beast. Her crew numbered over 2,400 men, living in what was almost a floating city. She had her own bakery, her own post office, even a cinema. While German cities burned under Allied bombs, life aboard the Tirpitz remained orderly, even comfortable. Hot meals, coffee, clean uniforms. The officers' mess served sausage, cheese, and bread, while across Europe civilians starved. For those who served aboard her, it was an honor. They saw themselves as the guardians of Germany's last great battleship, the one fortress the Allies could never reach. But by 1944, the walls of that fortress were closing in. The Allies were advancing on all fronts. Germany was running out of oil, steel, and hope. And still, the Tirpitz sat waiting in the frozen fjords, too valuable to risk, too powerful to abandon. Churchill grew obsessed. He once said, "The destruction of this ship is the greatest event at sea at the present time. No other target is comparable to it." And he meant it. The Royal Navy had tried. The Fleet Air Arm had tried. Both had failed, again and again. And so, as winter crept across the North Atlantic, Churchill turned to the only men who might still have a chance, the dam-busters and the precision bombers of 9 Squadron. Their orders: find the beast, strike it where it sleeps, and finish the job. The stage was set for one of the last great duels of World War II, man against machine, courage against steel, in the frozen silence of the Arctic North. By 1942, the war in the Arctic had become a chess match played in shadows. The Allies depended on convoys sailing from Scotland and Iceland to Murmansk and Archangel, icy lifelines carrying tanks, fuel, and food to the Soviet front. And every convoy that set sail did so under one terrible question: where is the Tirpitz? The German battleship no longer needed to move to do its job. It simply existed, a weapon of fear. Anchored in the fjords of northern Norway, it loomed over the map like a ghost. Whenever Allied codebreakers caught whispers of its movement, panic spread through the Admiralty in London. One false report could cancel an entire operation. One rumor could scatter a fleet. In June of that year, a convoy of 35 merchant ships, codenamed PQ-17, departed for Russia, escorted by a powerful screen of destroyers and cruisers. The men aboard knew the risks: submarine packs, Arctic storms, Luftwaffe bombers. But what they feared most was the rumor that Tirpitz had left her anchorage. On July 4, 1942, British intelligence picked up radio chatter suggesting the beast was at sea. No one had seen her, no torpedo wakes or radar signatures confirmed it. But the name alone was enough. The Admiralty panicked. They sent a single, fateful order: "Convoy is to scatter." It was one of the most disastrous commands ever given in the North Atlantic. The warships turned home. The merchantmen, now unprotected, were left to fend for themselves in waters crawling with U-boats and Luftwaffe patrols. In the days that followed, the Arctic became a slaughterhouse. One by one, ships burned on the horizon, their cargo exploding in pillars of fire that lit the polar night. Of the 35 merchant ships that set out, only 11 ever reached port. The rest were sunk, not by the Tirpitz, but by submarines and bombers that seized the opportunity she had created. Without firing a single shot, the Tirpitz had achieved one of Germany's greatest naval victories. A victory of psychology. To Churchill, it was a humiliation. He raged in his war room, calling the ship the Beast again, with hatred in his voice. "The destruction of this ship is the greatest event at sea at the present time," he repeated. The entire Allied command began to view Tirpitz not as a ship, but as an obsession, a curse that haunted the war at sea. From that point forward, her destruction became a personal mission for Churchill. The Royal Navy, exhausted and stretched thin, could do no more. Its carriers had failed. Its midget submarines had crippled the Tirpitz, but not destroyed her. So he turned to the sky. If the seas couldn't kill her, perhaps the air could. By 1944, 2 squadrons were chosen for the task, the most experienced and decorated in Bomber Command: 9 Squadron and 617 Squadron, the Dambusters. Together, they would hunt the Ghost in the fjords. The Allies had failed 33 times to sink her, but Churchill was done failing. He gave the order that would seal both the fate of the Tirpitz and of hundreds of German sailors still serving aboard her. From that moment on, the Beast of the North was no longer a phantom. It had been marked for death. By 1944, the war was turning against Germany. But in the north, beyond the Arctic Circle, the Tirpitz still lived. She had survived everything the Allies had thrown at her: torpedoes, mini-submarines, air raids, and sabotage. 33 attempts had failed. To Hitler, it was proof that the ship was unbreakable. To Churchill, it was unbearable. He called her the Beast. He swore she would die before the year was out. To destroy her, the British had tried everything imaginable. Submariners had crawled into the fjords in midget subs, tiny underwater coffins, carrying explosive charges on their bellies. They managed to damage the Tirpitz in 1943, but she limped back to safety. Carrier aircraft had struck again and again, only to see their bombs bounce harmlessly off her thick armor. Even manned torpedoes and diving teams had been sent in desperation. Nothing worked. It was as if the ship herself refused to die. By late 1944, with the Eastern Front collapsing and the Allies preparing for victory in Europe, Churchill demanded one final attempt, whatever the cost. He turned to the Royal Air Force and to the men whose names still carried legend: the Dambusters. The 617 Squadron had already proven themselves masters of precision. A year earlier, they had breached Germany's Ruhr dams using the revolutionary bouncing bomb created by inventor Barnes Wallis. Now Wallis had designed something even more devastating, a 12,000-pound weapon called the Tall Boy. Unlike ordinary bombs that scattered and tumbled, the Tall Boy was shaped like a dart, designed to fall straight and true. It didn't just explode on impact, it struck with supersonic speed, burying itself deep into the ground or hull before detonating, unleashing a shock wave powerful enough to crack the earth or break a battleship's spine. Wallis believed that, with the Tall Boy, the Tirpitz could finally be sunk, but only if it was dropped by the RAF's best. 2 squadrons were chosen. 9 Squadron, veterans of night raids across Europe, and 617 Squadron, the dam busters. Together they would fly Lancaster bombers, the pride of Britain's long-range fleet, across thousands of miles of open sea at the edge of their range into the most heavily defended target left in the war. The men were gathered at Woodhall Spa for a briefing that none of them would forget. The room was blacked out, maps were covered. Then, with deliberate drama, the cloth was pulled away, revealing a model of their target, the Tirpitz. A gasp filled the room. One pilot remembered it clearly. We'd heard of her, of course. Everyone had. The Beast of the North. When they told us that's where we were going, the room went quiet. You could feel it in your stomach. The plan was audacious. Because the Tirpitz lay beyond the range of a direct strike from Britain, the bombers would first fly more than 1,000 miles to northern Russia, refuel, and then continue to Norway. If anything went wrong, bad weather, fuel leaks, enemy patrols, there would be no turning back. They called it Operation Paravane, the first of several attempts that autumn. When that raid failed to destroy the ship, they went again in October and again in November. Each mission brought them closer, each flight pushing the limits of endurance and luck. By now, Churchill's obsession had become their burden too. Every pilot knew that failure meant leaving the North Atlantic unguarded through the winter and condemning countless sailors to die. So they prepared their aircraft with care. They stripped away armor, removed gun turrets, and even replaced floor panels with extra fuel tanks. Every pound saved meant a few more miles in the air. They flew training runs over the cold North Sea, practicing navigation with the stars, memorizing every mountain and fjord along the Norwegian coast. For weeks, they waited for the right weather. Clear skies over the Arctic, a narrow window in which to strike. Then finally, on a cold morning in November 1944, the order came through. Operation Catechism. Proceed. The mission Churchill had demanded for 2 long years was about to begin. The beast was cornered, and this time there would be no escape. The night before the raid was cold and silent across the airfields of northern Scotland. Each Lancaster bomber stood ready, sleek black silhouettes against the floodlights. Ground crews moved like ghosts, tightening bolts, checking engines, painting last-minute symbols of luck on the sides of the aircraft. Inside the briefing room, the final orders were read aloud. Target, Tirpitz. Location, Tromsø Fjord, Norway. Mission, destroy. There was no cheer, no applause. Just the quiet sound of pencils scratching coordinates onto flight charts. At precisely dawn, the engines came alive. 4 propellers per bomber churned the air into a low thunder that rolled across the Scottish coast. Each aircraft carried a single tallboy bomb, 12,000 pounds of destruction, the largest conventional weapon ever built at the time. But the Lancaster was not built for such distances. To reach Tromsø, the crews had to strip everything unnecessary. The armor plate behind the pilot was removed. The mid-upper turret was gone. Even the guns in the nose were taken out to save weight. Then came the extra fuel tanks, dangerous, improvised, and volatile. A Wellington tank held 200 gallons. A Mosquito tank held 50 more. They were stacked one atop the other inside the fuselage, where the crew usually stowed their rest beds. Each tank was so full of high-octane fuel that the men were forbidden to wear their standard leather boots. A spark from a metal heel could have blown the aircraft apart mid-air. So they flew in plimsolls, light canvas shoes meant for gym floors, across a frozen sea surrounded by flammable vapor. One pilot later recalled, You didn't think about fear. You just got on with it. That was our job. The Lancaster bombers lifted into the sky, one after another, forming a line of dark wings vanishing north. Below them, the sea glittered with ice. Ahead of them lay over 1,000 miles of open airspace, cold, empty, and unforgiving. They flew low to avoid radar, following the faint curve of the earth. There was no radio chatter. Silence was their shield. Only the dull hum of the engines and the occasional click of the navigator's stopwatch. The deeper they flew into the Arctic, the more unreal it felt. The horizon never quite darkened. The sun hovered like a pale ghost, circling but never setting. The cockpit windows frosted from within. Oxygen masks crackled with each breath. Somewhere ahead, past the Norwegian coastline, the Tirpitz lay waiting beneath camouflage nets. Her hull repaired after the last raid, her crew confident that no bomber could reach them again. They were wrong. By the time the first formation crossed the coast, the air was razor-sharp, the fjords below black and still. Snow clung to the cliffs like salt. To the crews, the landscape looked lifeless. Beautiful, but cruel. Then came the first flashes of anti-aircraft fire. Tracer shells burst in the distance, their red arcs floating like fireworks over the mountains. The gunners on the Tirpitz were awake. The intercoms crackled to life. Navigator to pilot, steady, visual on target sector. Through the bomb sights, the fjord appeared, a thin strip of gray water winding through the mountains. Somewhere below that camouflage, smoke lay the most feared ship in the world. After 2 years of obsession, 33 failed attacks, and nearly 500 lives lost, everything came down to this. 9 Squadron, the Dam Busters, 17 Lancaster bombers, one final chance. As the formation tightened, the lead pilot gave a calm command. "This is it, lads. No turning back." The beast was waiting, and the hunters were closing in. Unknown to the airmen high above the Arctic, the Germans were watching. Hidden radar stations dotted the Norwegian coastline, silent, invisible sentinels scanning the skies. One of them, perched on the island of Andoya, had just detected the incoming formation. Inside a small wooden bunker, German operators tracked the faint green echoes on their screens. Their orders were clear. If bombers appeared on course for Tromsø, the fighter wing at Bardufoss, a mere 15 minutes away by air, was to be scrambled immediately. The Luftwaffe's elite pilots were stationed there, aces who had each shot down more than 100 Allied aircraft. To defend the Tirpitz was their standing mission. If they reached the Lancasters in time, the British would be slaughtered. But something strange happened that morning. The warning never came. Radar reports were confused. Some claimed the bombers were heading toward Russia, others that they were 100 kilometers to the north. The men at Bardufoss waited for confirmation that never arrived. By the time the alarm was sounded, it was already too late. Decades later, historians would uncover clues that hinted at something more, something almost unbelievable. A German radar officer stationed at Andoya, Lieutenant Karl Heinrich Westner, may have been quietly working against his own command. Norwegian locals later recalled that Westner sympathized with the Allies. He spoke of his hatred for the Nazis and carried, hidden inside his cigarette case, a small engraving of the Union Jack. Records discovered after the war suggest that Westner and several of his colleagues were part of an informal resistance network. If true, their actions may have changed history. By delaying the signal, or by deliberately misdirecting it, they may have prevented the Luftwaffe from intercepting the bombers at all. Whatever the truth, that morning, fate was kind to the RAF. As the Lancasters crossed the Norwegian coast, they were still completely unchallenged. The men in the cockpits didn't know why. They expected to see German fighters diving out of the clouds at any second. Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs streaking in with guns blazing. But the skies were empty. Only the cold sun hung over the fjords. One pilot later said, "We couldn't believe it. We thought the radar had missed us, but it hadn't. Someone must have been looking out for us." Back at Bardufoss, the fighter base finally received the alarm. Engines were started. Mechanics shouted orders. But disaster struck again. The aircraft were parked at the wrong end of the runway. As they taxied into position, a transport plane was cleared to land, blocking the strip. 5 more minutes were lost. 5 minutes that would decide everything. At 8:09 a.m., the Tirpitz's own radar finally caught the formation, 30 minutes away and heading straight for them. The ship's crew scrambled to their stations, engines fired up, and anti-aircraft guns began to track the distant specks in the sky. Below the clouds in Tromsø Fjord, sailors ran across the decks, shouting, manning their stations. Inside the steel hull, others braced for impact. And above them, 17 British bombers approached in perfect formation, unaware that the most dangerous airspace in the world had just opened before them. The Germans had everything they needed to destroy them: radar, flak, and fighter squadrons. And yet, none of it would matter. By the time the Messerschmitts finally took off, the battle had already begun. The beast was about to face her hunters, alone. The Arctic sky was clear, a cold, colorless blue that gave no shelter. At 8:30 a.m., the first Lancasters broke through the clouds. Below them, the fjord shimmered like glass, and in the center of that stillness lay the Tirpitz, her gray hull blending with the mountains, her camouflage nets pulled away, her guns already turning skyward. The beast was awake. At 15,000 feet, the bombers began their final approach. The air inside the cockpits felt tight, heavy with oxygen and nerves. Each man knew his role by heart, every command drilled, every second timed. The intercoms crackled. Steady, steady, target in sight. Then the horizon lit up. The Tirpitz fired first. Her massive 15-inch guns, designed to sink battleships, were elevated toward the heavens. Each shell weighed over a ton, and when fired, it rose through the sky in slow, fiery arcs the size of houses. The shock wave alone could tear the wings off a plane. Below them, the ship's smaller guns opened up, flak cannons, Bofors, machine guns, filling the air with steel. Tracer fire wove red patterns through the sky, exploding at the bomber's altitude with deafening precision. It was a storm of light and death. One navigator remembered, you could actually see the shells coming up, drifting slowly, almost gracefully. Then you'd remember they were coming for you. Still, the formation held. The first bomber lined up its sight. In the bomb bay below, a tall boy waited, painted green, spinning on its fins. At 8:41 a.m., the bomb doors opened, the release light flashed, and the first tall boy fell. From 15,000 feet, it dropped silently, then broke the sound barrier. It hit midships. A perfect strike. A flash. Then a sound like the earth itself splitting open. Within seconds, another bomb followed, then another. The second hit near a turret, flipping the massive gun into the air. Others struck close to the hull, detonating underwater, their shockwaves bending the ship's spine like paper. One near miss was enough to throw men off their feet, to tear steel bulkheads apart, to send fire racing down the corridors. Inside the Tirpitz, chaos reigned. Sailors ran through smoke-filled compartments, shouting orders drowned by the roar of flames. Power failed. The deck tilted. The ship groaned as though alive, metal twisting and splitting under its own weight. Those above deck could see the bombs falling like darts through the clear sky. Those below felt the world convulse. In less than 2 minutes, 9 bombers had released their payloads. 2 direct hits, 3 near misses. Enough to finish her. One crewman aboard later recalled, "It was like being inside an earthquake. The floor rose, the lights went out, and the next thing, we were sideways." The Tirpitz began to roll. Her hull, 50,000 tons of iron and pride, heaved to port. Men scrambled for the railings as water rushed in. Oil poured across the surface, blackening the sea. Some jumped, others never made it. Within 10 minutes, the ship that Hitler called unsinkable was gone. She capsized completely, her keel now facing the gray sky. Only a thin stream of smoke marked where she had been. Up above, the bombers turned for home. Not a single one had been shot down. No fighters, no losses, only disbelief. They had done the impossible. They had slain the beast. And yet, even as they flew away, the men below were dying. Trapped inside the overturned hull, hundreds of German sailors pounded on the steel from within. Their voices were faint, then gone. As the tide rose, rescuers heard them singing Deutschland über alles until the water filled their lungs. When it was over, nearly 1,000 men were dead. The fjord was silent again. Only ripples spread where the Tirpitz had been, the last great battleship of the Reich, now lying broken beneath the Arctic sun. When the echoes faded across Tromsø fjord, all that remained was the sound of water. The once mighty Tirpitz lay upside down, her hull a floating tomb of steel and silence. Rescue boats rushed to the scene, cutting through the oily Black Sea. They found wreckage, bodies, and men clinging to driftwood, their faces ghostly pale beneath layers of fuel and frost. Some survivors swam toward the shore. Others never surfaced at all. Out of her crew of 1,700, only a few hundred lived. The rest were entombed inside, trapped behind locked hatches and twisted bulkheads. Divers later reported the eerie sight of hands pressed against the portholes from within, frozen in place, reaching for the light that would never come. It was a victory, but a tragic one. For the Allies, the sinking of the Tirpitz was a triumph of precision, technology, and sheer determination. For the Germans, it was the end of a dream and the death of nearly 1,000 sons. Back in Britain, news of the success reached Winston Churchill almost instantly. He wrote to Stalin, "RAF bombers have sunk the Tirpitz. Let us rejoice together." For 2 years he had called it the Beast. Now, at last, the beast was dead. At the bomber bases in Scotland, the airmen landed to the sound of cheers. There was relief, more than celebration. They had all made it back, every single one. No enemy fighters, no losses, just disbelief. One pilot recalled, "We didn't even know she'd gone under until the message came through on the radio. Then the whole room erupted. We'd done it. After all that, we'd finally sunk the beast." That night they celebrated in the mess with beer, laughter, and the kind of joy that comes only after surviving what shouldn't have been survivable. But the feeling didn't last. Even the most hardened men felt the weight of what they had done. Years later, many would admit that the memory never truly left them. The sight of that ship rolling over, the thought of the men trapped inside. It wasn't victory they remembered. It was the silence afterward. For decades, one question lingered. How had they gotten through alive? Radar had spotted them. Fighters were nearby. The Tirpitz's defenses were ready. And yet, the skies remained clear. In the years after the war, historians uncovered the story of Lieutenant Karl Heinrich Westner, the German radar officer on the island of Andoya. Locals remembered him as kind, quiet, and secretly sympathetic to the Allies. He had shown them a silver cigarette case engraved with the Union Jack. Newly discovered documents confirmed that Westner was working with the Norwegian resistance. He and several others had planned to sabotage their own systems if an Allied attack ever came. When the bombers appeared on radar, it's believed he delayed sending the alert to Bardufoss, just long enough to keep the fighters grounded. If true, then a single act of quiet rebellion, a German officer's moment of conscience, may have saved hundreds of British lives and sealed the fate of the Tirpitz. 70 years later, only fragments of the ship remain, twisted metal scattered across the fjord floor, now home to fish and seaweed. Each November, veterans of 9 Squadron and 617 Squadron gather to remember that day. They call it Tirpitz Day. Among them once sat 2 old men, Tony Iveson, one of the British pilots, and Kurt Schultz, a German fighter ace from Bardufoss. Enemies in 1944, friends in old age. They spoke softly, drank together, and never once argued about the war. "We never talked about fighting," Kurt said. "We talked about life, about how lucky we were that it ended." For Tony, the memory of that morning never faded. The bright fjord, the rising smoke, the silence that followed. He once said, "It's strange. We did what we had to do, but I still think about the men on that ship. We were all just boys doing what the politicians told us." And perhaps that's what makes the story of the Tirpitz so haunting. It wasn't just the end of a battleship. It was the end of an age, of steel giants and naval empires, of young men flung into the cold by history. The beast of the North lies silent now, but beneath the Arctic waves her story still echoes, a reminder that even the strongest can fall, and that in war, victory and tragedy often share the same breath.